Well, it may become obvious. This week I've been talking about the newness that Christ brings into our lives. And as I said on Monday, people are often talking about new things, but we know that in reality there's nothing new under the sun. They are just repackaged or reconfigured. They got a new paint job or whatever. But the reality is that everything pretty much stays the same. The only time we become truly new is when we are born again. And we experience something that doesn't exist on the human plane or the earthly plane, and that's the new birth, the spiritual experience with God. So that before I knew Christ, what I'm connected with is time and space and matter. I mean, I'm kind of locked into this dimension that I can't escape. But when Christ came into my life, I really entered into a new dimension of reality. A reality that I didn't know existed before it came and brought me into it. And now that I'm in that new reality, I find I have a new role in life. I have a new mission for my life. I'm part of a new community. And as a consequence, I hope I'm not overworking this, but I kind of start making a new sound with my life, where Peter goes on to say that because we are a people who are part of a holy nation and we belong to God, that we find ourselves declaring the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Think about it for a moment. When you first asked Christ into your life, something happened. Now, if you're saying, well, I prayed that prayer and nothing happened, I have a question for you. Do you know if you really surrendered your life to Christ, or were you just trying a new option? Because I've had people I've talked to before who have turned away from the Lord, and when I've asked them, well, why did you do that? And the answer, surprisingly, was, well, I tried it, I didn't get what I wanted, and so I turned away from it. I mean, Kanye West is probably one of the latest examples who said he turned away from Christianity because God didn't answer his prayers. Well, God didn't answer his prayers the way he wanted his prayers to be answered, and so as a result, he moved on. And I have to sit back and say, Lord, did he ever really know you? I mean, I only God knows the answer to that question. But I know that when I asked Christ in my heart, I was different. And I wouldn't say that I was immediately better or smarter or kinder or, in any of those kind of things, but I was different. I mean, reality made a major shift, and it was like going from darkness into light. Suddenly I saw myself, I saw the people around me, the world that I was in through a different lens. I saw my parents differently. I saw my brother differently. I saw everything. My friends and relationships all became different. And I think one of the major things I encountered is when I began to go around to some of my people who I've been involved with, particularly with drugs and other things before I was saved, and I started sharing with them this new life that I experienced in Christ. Most of them just simply were disinterested in continuing relationship with me. And I was also not particularly interested in pursuing them because there was nothing to talk about. They found pleasure in things that I no longer was interested in. You might say that the very appetites of your soul begin to change and you're attracted to something very different. And so what happens is it's that new attraction that takes you down paths that makes a statement, if you will. That's what the idea of declaring the praises of him is all about. Your life is now making a new statement. My statement before I was saved was, it's all about me. It's all about what I want. It's all about how it benefits me, how it advantages me. And suddenly I came to Christ and I realized, no, it's all about him. Now, that doesn't mean I never thought or did selfish things, but I didn't feel good about it. When I did, I felt this tremendous sense of conviction and guilt, especially when God made it obvious to me, and I realized it was wrong. So I started feeling and recognizing that things were wrong in my life that I had never felt uncomfortable with before. So the kind of things that I used to find pleasure in now became very distasteful to me, and I didn't want that to be part of my life anymore. And you know what happened? The people who knew me began to realize something's happened here. You're different. You've changed. And I was struck. Even my roommates in college, they didn't say it to me, but they told my brother after I had left school that they said, when your brother became a Christian, he completely changed. Now, I was not aware of that. I didn't see that in myself. They saw it. They didn't want to become Christians, but they recognized I was not the same person I was prior to that. My parents began to see it. My dad, particularly, when he gave his life ultimately to Christ, he said, you know, you were just completely different. Your life was completely different. You changed completely. I remember the first time I went home and my dad picked me up in his great big Lincoln Continental. And we were driving along and he kept on looking at me and I wondered, what are you looking at? And he finally said, aren't you going to turn on the radio? And I thought, no, it never even occurred to me. He said, before, you always get in the car, the first thing you do is turn the radio and switch it to one of your rock and roll stations. And now you've been sitting in this car for 30 minutes. You haven't even turned the radio on. What's going on? I said, I'm just not interested. He was really puzzled. But that kind of puzzlement began the conversation of what's going on? What's changed about you? Now, my dad was pretty upset when I became a Christian because he had other plans for my life. And it wasn't that I was rejecting going to law school. What I was doing is saying, I'm not pursuing that right now. I'm just, pursuing God. I'm just taking time to find out who God is and to get to know Jesus Christ. And this was during the Vietnam War, and the draft was on, and eventually my number came up, and that's a whole story unto itself. And he was very concerned about that because he'd survived 3 wars, and he wasn't interested in me going to war. And so, it was this really weird dynamic. So he didn't really like the idea that I wasn't doing what he thought was best for me. But at the same time, he was kind of puzzled and intrigued by the fact that I was just a different person, that something dramatic had happened in my life. And I think that that's when we think about, are we being a witness? Many times we don't think we are because we don't see ourselves as being different. We don't see ourselves touching other people's lives. But the reality is, without thinking about it, if I'm seeking Jesus, I'm going to become a different person. It's just going to lead me in a direction. I'm going to follow him, and I'm going to find myself doing different things, saying different things, responding differently to things. Even when I respond incorrectly, I find myself going back and saying, I need to apologize for the way I acted. Because God has been that change agent in my life, even with me being unaware of it. I think one of my great examples from the Old Testament is, of course, Joseph. Who doesn't like Joseph, right? But I see this kind of pompous, arrogant, spoiled, self-indulged favorite child of his father who had basically offended his older brothers to the point that they wanted to kill him. And, oftentimes we kind of, we really kind of pound down on the older brothers, and what they did was terribly wrong. But I kind of get it. Because they're loving, they yearn for their father's approval, and basically their personalities have just been so mangled by Jacob's obsession with one son over the rest, his favoritism, if you will. And a lot of us know that dynamic. We experienced it. I mean, to some degree, I experienced it with my parents. I was unexpected, and I was, I proved to be an irritation to them many, many times. But the whole point was that you can begin to look at that and focus on that, but God was doing something in Joseph's life. And I think about those 13 years when he went from being a captive to being a slave to being a prisoner, that there was dramatic changes that took place in his life, that he no longer was in charge, but rather he was charged by others. He was controlled by others. He no longer had control. He was no longer the cock of the walk. He was, the fried chicken in the oven. And basically, people didn't survive long as slaves in Egypt or as prisoners in Egypt. They rarely ever made it to 30 years of age. And here's Joseph at 30, and suddenly God elevates him. And we can sit back and say, okay, why did God do that to this guy? And the answer is pretty obvious. God was shaping and molding and forming him to what he wanted him to be. He had hammered him and pounded him and crushed him in every way you can imagine, because God had to take this young man and remold him after the image of what he wanted to be able to give him great power, wealth, and authority, but not be corrupted by that. And that's the biggest problem we find, is that people who make power and wealth and authority their goal, they're already corrupted by it, even if they don't have it or if they ever give it. But for those who have been taken through seasons of hardships and difficulties. Their hearts have been broken over and over again. Their dreams have been crushed. They've experienced disappointment in relationships over and over again. At the end of that, if we're willing, God can begin to shape and mold us into something that is extremely usable, but also is safe for God to use us. That's why Paul made that comment in 1 Timothy 3 that you should never promote a new believer to a position of responsibility and authority, because they'll fall into pride, and they'll fall, which is the same thing that the devil fell into. And so when we're going through difficult times, when we're basically feel like we're in the path of downward mobility in every area of our life, don't lose sight of the fact that God is still on the throne. You're still part of the royal priesthood. You're still part of his greater plan. You are a chosen person, and he has something that he has in store for you. Embrace the humiliation, because God has promotion in your future when he knows that you're safe enough to entrust with that promotion. Well, one more to go, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. God bless you and go in his grace.